Hello and welcome to the India Briefing. I'm Mukulika Banerjee in London, joined by my co-host Pragya Tiwari in Delhi. This is the first episode of 2025, and we have two very special guests to join us to talk about what lies ahead, what has come so where we are, and so on. They are Amit Verma and Milan Vaishnav, both writers who also host two very successful podcast shows. Both their podcasts have a focus on India, and over several seasons, they've spoken to a range of authors about their lives and their writing. Listeners of their shows will know that each have a very distinctive style. Amit Varma is a writer, journalist, and host of The Seen and the Unseen, and more recently, the weekly podcast Everything is Everything with Ajay Shah. He runs writing workshops, makes documentaries, and is generally a man of endless curiosity. Milan Vaishnav is an academic and host of the Grand Tamasha podcast, in which he talks to authors about their recently published books with very searching questions. His day job is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. His primary research focus is on the political economy of India, and he examines issues of corruption and governance, state capacity, distributed politics, and electoral behavior. And the books he covers, though, despite his own research interests, are of an enormous range, everything from foreign policy to state capacity to history. So we thought, Pragya and I, this week, we would talk to Amit and Milan about what they have learned, taken away from the enormous number of conversations they've had with a wide range of authors, what their main takeaways are, whether we can reflect on the podcast form as a way of thinking about India, and generally to think with us about what are the big issues that face India, which we thought might be of interest to our listeners. So, Pragya, do you want to start?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that introduction, Mukulika, and thank you both of you for joining us. I think, like Mukulika was saying, I'll just add one thing to it. Like the two of you, both of us also do a number of different things, and we started this podcast late last year, and it's been not the easiest thing to do to juggle the podcast with all our travels and writing and day jobs and so on. And towards the end of the year, we were talking about why we really want to do this, because it's clear to us that we really want to do this, we really enjoy this. And while doing that, I think we started to think about podcasts we love. And obviously, when it comes to India, it's Amit's podcast and it's Milan's podcast. I mean, these are our go-tos. And we found ourselves wondering aloud what it is that drives the two of you, what it is that, because you're, like I've already mentioned, and like she has said in your introduction, both of you also juggle many different hats. So to that end, we were like, why don't we call them over to the podcast and ask them? And here we are. So I'm going to ask a very difficult question to begin with. Do you have any favorites? Now, you've done 400 odd episodes, 400 and something. Amit, frankly, who's counting anymore? Milan, you just told me you're at 240, 250. Wow, these are staggering numbers. So first of all, congratulations. But also, do you have any favorites? Now, at first glance, this can sound like a tricky question. But what I mean by favorite is not a reflection on your guest or the book or the topic you feature. You could be having a conversation with a guest or a writer whose work you deeply admire, but perhaps on that day, the conversation just doesn't hit the right notes or all the right notes. And every once in a while, you go in with low expectations into a conversation, and it just transcends, the potential you thought it had. So in that sense, perhaps, what might be some of your favorite episodes that you find yourselves going back to? I'll start with you, Milan.
Thanks very much. It's really fun to do this with Amit and with both of you. So I'm gonna punt a little bit in two respects. I'm gonna name not an episode but a guest. I'm gonna name a guest who's a colleague actually of mine at Carnegie, who is Ashley Tellis. Some of you probably know Ashley. I've talked with him. I usually try and have Ashley on once a season. So we do 2 seasons a year. We do sort of a spring and a fall season, so about 40 episodes or so every year. And I try to have Ashley on, so almost twice a year. I've yet to meet somebody else, and I meet a lot of people in the kind of think tank, policy, academic research community who are as clear and as grounded in first principles as Ashley. When I hear him speak, and his subject is really Indian foreign policy, U.S.-India relations, India's role in the world. I go back to my days as an undergraduate in college, where sometimes in those classes, Mukulika, I'm sure this doesn't happen in your class, but there are those professors, those teachers, you just struggle to follow the thread, right? I mean, you're trying to take notes desperately, and just nothing really fits, and you're kind of at sea. And Ashley is one of these classic people. He got his PhD at University of Chicago, so maybe that tells you something. Who speaks in Roman numeral outline, right? And so it's very clear to follow. Okay, these are the 4 big points. These are the pieces of evidence in support of each. And I think in terms of our recent conversations, just turning to the substance, we've talked a lot about kind of India's role in the world. And I think, one of the things that Ashley has impressed upon me is there has been this rhetorical shift during this government of India no longer wanting to be a balancing power as some kind of pawn in a larger geopolitical game. India aspires to, under Modi's leadership, to be a leading power, right? And I think, Jay Shankar and others have often talked about this, but there is a real gap between aspiration and ambition and kind of hard power material realities, right? And so in many ways, it appears as if kind of India is punching above its weight, but there are moments in time, whether it comes to trade policy, the domestic economy, its ability to project military power overseas, where it's running up against these really significant hard power constraints. And I think sometimes it's easy for us to get carried away in the zeitgeist, right? Which is, this is India's century, this is India's time. India is playing kind of 3-dimensional chess and so on and so forth. And to be fair, I think it has very skillfully navigated this very complex moment. But that doesn't mean that the underlying fundamentals of state capacity, of military power, of economic power can just be wished away. And I think that's something that I've taken away from my conversations with Ashley.
That's an excellent answer. I love your episodes with him. Amit, how would you answer this?
I'll give a 3-part answer, and part 1 of my answer, and I'm not just saying this because she's one of the 4 windows on the screen, but I thought my episode with Mukulika really surprised me. I really loved it. Partly because, when we first fixed up the episode, I thought it's just going to be about her latest book on voting and elections. But as I got into her earlier books, especially her books on Pathan, on her PhD research that took her through the 90s, I found it deeply illuminating and moving for me, especially really the parts where she spoke about her mother. There's this one anecdote where she tells her mother about, how she had to eat, beef in NWFP when she was there because that was the cheapest food for the people who would host her. And her mother said, ki, bete theek hi kiya, ye to insaniyat hai. And I tell that story often to many people to talk about how, all Hinduism is not just this militant political version that we find. So that's part 1 of my answer. It was just a surprisingly beautiful episode. And the word surprisingly indicates a lot because a lot of my episodes, I go in not expecting anything, not knowing what it's going to be, and then you're pleasantly surprised in different ways. I'm a little hesitant of taking names because I think what's happened is after my episodes have gotten longer, after they went from the 1 hour, 2 hour episodes to the 8 hours, 9 hours episodes, practically every episode I do is deeply rewarding because you inevitably get into those vulnerable spaces and have those deep conversations. So it's just that vibe more than a particular guest that I like. But if I had to name particular guests, I love my episode with the economist Soumya Dhanraj, who, unlike most of the economists you'll meet, was not from some elite privileged family with a foreign degree, but she was a daughter of factory workers. Her mother sold tea at a tea stall outside the Coimbatore highway. and she arrived at a deep understanding of the world in a bottom-up way while getting the education she got and, deep curiosity. And that's the kind of economist I like best, who really have an understanding from the bottom up. I thought that was beautiful. I've, enjoyed my episodes with Amitav Kumar, Chandrahas Chaudhary, Mrinal and Ira Pandey, deeply rooted people and give you a sense of another time. Swapna Little, Rakshinda Jalil. My longer episodes, people often say that some of your episodes are so long, but my 8-hour episodes with Shanta Gokhale and Jerry Pinto are both beautiful and very close to my heart. Both of them were very generous and, opened their hearts up to me. They're episodes I cherish. What Milan just said about Ashley, having everything neatly organized and all of that applies to Pratap Bhanu Mehta. My 2 episodes with him have been great. And I'm very, very fond of Ramchandra Guha as a person. We've done 6 episodes together. And when I trace the arc of those episodes, we get more and more personal, to the point that when we did our last episode, we were like, he just said, Amit, I just want to talk with you. Let's not talk about the book. Let's just chat. And I found that beautiful. And that's kind of the vibe that I like. So honestly, it's, people ask me what episodes have disappointed you. And over the last 4-5 years since I reached the long form, literally nothing. Because it's such a privilege to be able to sit with people and have them open out to you in the way that they do, and I just absolutely love that. It's a great joy every time.
So can I weigh in here, because I have some favorite episodes of Amit's, and in fact they're early episodes. It's like, you look at Bob Dylan's career. There's like the pre-electric guitar and the post-electric guitar. So this is from like the early Amit phase. You did 2 episodes with Srinath Raghavan. I think one was on Article 370, and the second was on sort of Citizenship Amendment Act and, related issues, which I think if you go back and listen to those today, are some of the best resources out there to understand the historical nuance and facts around 2 very complicated issues that go back deep into history. And I just wanted to be a fanboy for a second and mention that, both because I love those episodes and I love Srinath's work. Those, I think, Amit, was when you started to dabble with longer form episodes. And I think for a time anyway, Srinath's were 2 of the most popular. And I think there's good reason for that.
I'll also add that at the time, like there was a time when those 2 episodes with Srinath were number 1 and number 2 in top downloaded episodes. They've now been replaced by 2 episodes I love, and the titles will tell you a lot about Indian society. Number 1 is The Loneliness of the Indian Woman with Shrana Bhattacharya, and number 2 is The Loneliness of the Indian Man with Nikhil Taneja. And, they're both lovely episodes, but the fact that, the way they're titled should tell you a lot about, that the world is complicated.
Yeah, I think Mukulika and me would also perhaps like to weigh in on our favorite episodes of from the 2 of you. But I will start by saying that I absolutely agree, and I'm not saying this, and it's almost awkward to say this because Mukulika is my co-host. She's a dear friend of mine. But I was telling her last night, dog tired at 11 p.m. We were having a conversation. I was telling her that I began listening to her episode with you. At first it felt like a waste because it's a longish episode and I would rather hear somebody else. I feel like, I'm fortunate enough to speak as much as I do to Mukulika. We've been talking to each other over the years, and I was like, I don't know what I could get out of this episode. And I was telling her that, perhaps the way in which she spoke about her concept of cultivating democracy with you is perhaps even better than the way she wrote about it. And I was absolutely stunned by that episode. Not that I expect any less from her, but because as somebody who thinks of herself as a close friend of Mukulika's, I didn't expect to. I was listening to it for solidarity. I was listening to it perhaps to give her some feedback. I wasn't expecting to be gobsmacked by it. So in that sense, I would absolutely have to agree that that's a brilliant episode. I was telling you before we started shooting that I love your episodes with Amitabha, and I feel like that should be just obligatory. You have to do one every 3 months with Amitabha Kumar. I think those are my absolute favorite. But my God, I don't know how you managed to pick so easily. I don't know how I would have been able to do that. I think I also really love and I'm going to restrict myself to, I think, the last 2 years because I couldn't possibly do it over 400. I really loved your conversation with Manu recently. I thought that was just very well done.
Thank you.
But also, I think I absolutely loved your conversation with Ranjit Muskote. And again, a very similar feeling where I've had the privilege to have so many conversations with Ranjit. I've been reading him for a very, very long time. I've been in conversation with him. And in fact, I think there is something that you brought out about the body of his work and the deep, gentle passion that he sort of brings to everything that he takes on. And I thought that was just immaculate. Milan, with you, I think, again, I just talk about very, very recent episodes. I really enjoyed the one on populism. I absolutely love the one with Soledad, which we in fact quote in one of our previous episodes that we did. I think just the one before this, we quote your episode with Soledad. Absolutely love the one with on populism. I really liked Dalits in the New Millennium. I feel like now I'm just going to end up, rattling out the entire list of episodes you did last year. But I think if I had to pick three, these would be my top three. Muku, would you like to add to this?
Absolutely not. This is my world. I can't pick one academic over the other and so on. Writers, it's easier. But I'll tell you what I can add to this. Having had the privilege of being been both on Milan's and Amit's shows, let me say what as an academic, as an author, I got, which was very distinct from both your shows. And it really informed the way I think about hosting our own podcast now. Milan, the book had just come out, Cultivating Democracy. There were lots of, I was being asked to write 1,000 word summaries of it for various, that's the way you've got to promote a book nowadays. Not, writing 100,000 word book is clearly not the way to communicate your ideas to the world anymore. It's there almost as a prop, and you've got to then entice the reader in because there is so much out there and people are reading less and less. And we'll talk about this in a minute. But Milan, what I appreciated in my interview with you, and I think in all your episodes, is the crispness of the questions. And that is rare. You don't even get that in an academic seminar. People ramble and, they're trying to show off what they know. They're grandstanding. And then eventually somewhere in all that rambling, there's a question. Not always, but often that happens in academic seminars because it's a conversation in a seminar. Whereas here, the economy of being given a very pointed question that then forces you to articulate your argument with equal crispness. And so I agree what you said about Ashley completely. I never miss an episode with him. But I think some of that Ashley-like quality is there in your questions. And that's there in a lot of the episodes you do with a wide range of academics, right? And then often they're outside your core expertise area. And then it becomes even more important to get that essence of the book. And then, it's a stepping point for me, and we'll talk about our listening and reading practices later. But often that initial conversation is just a stepping point. I've got the essence. It's like reading a summary, but by the author, and then you go and explore the rest of it. Amit's questions were completely different. Completely. They could not be more different. Because, and when I think about your episodes and why I enjoy listening to them, I think now I take your advice of listening to it at 2 times the speed. Once you got used to the nuance of the speakers, then it's very easy to listen to it at twice the speed. It's almost never the case that an academic or a writer of any sort is given the space to think about what formed them. And what formed them are not just books they've read and essays they've written. It is the influences on their thinking, their childhood, their social life, their travel. And suddenly there was space to talk about it, and there was genuine interest, right? It was not just a cursory going over, where did you grow up kind of thing. But if you went to a certain kind of school, how did that make you think about curiosity or guilt or whatever? And that to me is unique in this space, because we read people in we see authors in two dimensions normally. If you don't know, and if you're not plugged in, and I think there is a democratizing sentiment behind filling in that background, because the world of writers, academics who are publishing books that would show up in your podcast is a world that in many ways it's extremely elitist. It's very closed. Most of our readership are not, at literature festivals or bumping into them or know them personally. Whereas here is a chance to get to know people's lives personally as if you're chatting with them in a party. And that, I think, says something about how academic knowledge or any writing is produced. And that's valuable. I think okay, I'm not going to get this reading a book. No way. So a podcast becomes the only way, in fact, to communicate it. And it's intimate. It's just two people chatting.
Thank you.
That's my takeaway.
I mean, if I could just add one thing, I mean, what I find so impressive about Amit does is that, recently he's had two guests on who I consider to be very close personal friends. One is Tanvi Madan and the other is Yamini Iyer. And I've known them for a very, very long time now. I mean, Yamini, 15, 16 years, and Tanvi maybe the last, 12, 13 years. And there were so many things that I learned about them through those conversations that I was just, as I was listening, I was just like, I can't believe that I didn't know this about you, right? This fact, this story, this thing that happened to you when you were growing up, or, your first job and so on and forth. And so that just adds a whole richness, right, to understanding a person and sort of who they become today, which is, I think, a remarkable skill. It's not so easy for any old podcast interviewer to be able to elicit that kind of really almost vulnerable information from someone.
I think I was going to say the same thing. I was going to say that, in fact, even for people we know, just to disagree with you a little bit, Mukulika, or just to kind of add to it, if you will, that even people we've spoken to any number of, we've had conversations with them, we've run into them in parties, and we think we know them. I think it's been a privilege to be able to partake of, like someone like Shanta Gokulam's work I've followed because I was theatre critic for a very, very long time, and she's been very formative in my thinking of theatre. There's just those bits about her early life and how she was growing up just completely turned around my understanding of her work and the context of her work. And the only thing I'd like to add to what Mukulika, you so beautifully said about Milan's podcast is that, one thing you really, I don't know if you give yourself enough credit for it, but if you don't, you should, Milan, because one of the things you managed to do is you're speaking to so many academics in your podcast. And the only thing I want to add to what Mukulika said so beautifully about your work, Milan, is that, your episodes are sort of more constricted when it comes to time, 40 odd minutes to about an hour, unlike Amit's. You're dealing with some very dense concepts because you're often talking to academics. Your questions are very crisp, like Mukulika said. And yet I feel like you managed to really get to the essence of the work of the person you're speaking with. And you manage to make the content accessible without taking away from its integrity in any way. And I don't think that's a small feat. So I hope you give yourself enough credit for that. But now moving on to perhaps an even more difficult question than I started with. I'm curious to understand, to know what might be some of the ideas and observations that have come up in the conversations you've had. And of course, you can talk about conversations you've had lately or go back into history that have really stood out for you. And again, I do want to clarify that I don't, these things keep shifting for us depending on our preoccupations in this very minute. So for example, you could name 5 ideas or observations that come up for you now because you're thinking a lot about an X period in history or X, X policy. And that could shift 2 months later or 3 months later. So with that caveat, I am curious to know, if I ask you this question, what might be some of the ideas and observations that have come up in your conversations that really stand out for you? Again, perhaps Milan, we could start with you and then move on to Amit.
Yeah, it's a really good and tough question. Let me maybe just name two or three. I think the first is that, there's this famous uh, essay by the economist Lant Pritchett, which is about India as a flailing state, right? And this has been, I think, for many of us, kind of central to our mental models of how India works, right? Which is that you have a relatively well-functioning system at the elite level. So you have institutions like the Supreme Court, the Election Commission, the RBI. And then as you get from the head closer to the limbs, which implicate things like Panchayati Raj, local government, you end up in a system where all of a sudden doing things like basic health, education, water, sanitation is much more difficult, right? Um, and some recent conversations have led me, and it's something that I've written about as a reflection, to think about whether or not part of this flailing state has actually become inverted, right? I mean, if you think about, for instance, I was thinking about my conversation with Gautam Bhatia on the Supreme Court. We've talked about the kind of, we had an episode with Sunetra Chaudhary and Rahul Verma on the election outcome, the general elections, talking about the conduct of the Election Commission of India, right? I mean, some of these institutions that we've had so much trust in, that the Indian people have had so much trust in, that sense of trust has really evaporated. And in fact, when we look at, say, welfare schemes and local delivery, I don't want to sound like everything is hunky-dory, but there have been some pretty significant improvements, right? They may not be as great as this government would like you to believe when it comes to things like sanitation or electrification, but they are very real. And many of those things are implemented, locally, particularly by state governments. So I think for me, that has been like a real shock to my system of how I think about kind of Indian state capacity and the working of the state. The second is about sort of caste and clientelism, right? I mean, we tend to, again, think, particularly in the academic setting, of India as a kind of classic patronage democracy, where, you have this group of very savvy politicians who are playing these very sophisticated games on the basis of caste, ethnicity, in order to kind of trade favors for votes. I was really struck by a recent book that was one of my favorites from 2023. It's a book by two academics, Tariq Tachel and Adam Auerbach, who are sort of two of the best political scientists, I think, of their generation, who study how local politics works in squatter settlements in Jaipur and Bhopal in particular. And one of the things that they find is actually, a lot of what they're describing happening, and these are the real heart of, kind of where the rubber meets the road, is classic constituency service. That's what we would call it in the United States, right? I mean, we don't call it patronage in the U.S. We call it, dealing with constituents who have everyday problems where, frankly, you don't have the luxury of discriminating against particular people in order to get their work done because of the nature of coalitions, when the units of governance are really small. That, to me, I think, again, really shaped my views about how, it's not to say that, caste identity politics have disappeared, right? But I think, again, for those of us in the research community, I think it's become a kind of a lazy trope that we rely on that and we miss a lot of nuance. So those are two in particular. There are many more, but maybe I'm sure Amit has his own.
Yeah, I'll start by just responding to all the unexpected praise you guys lavished upon me, and I was reminded of that Hindi film line "Bas kar pagli rulayegi kya." So that was kind of where I was. I'll to answer your question, I'll begin with a caveat that Mukulika, just before we started recording, was came up shared with us this great quote about how reading the news today involves this great trade-off between staying informed and staying sane. And what I've done with my podcast, as you guys also mentioned, is I've kind of moved away from what is, tied to the news cycle and looked for stuff which is more timeless and looks more at the life and times of people than of any current concern that is happening. And a result of that is that I don't have anything super current to say. I've almost kind of disconnected from it. But here are some overall learnings that I've learned over the past 8 years. And, both these main learnings are kind of depressing, and it's a lament. And the first one is that when I started the podcast, I would have imagined that there is a fringe out there that is unlike me, and all of us, all four of us, are really what India is. This is the idea of India. and that we are broadly secular and liberal and etc. etc. You know exactly what I mean. And I realized as the years went by that we are the fringe, that we are the outliers, that Indian society, and of course, like John Robinson said, anything you say of India, the opposite is also true. But I realized that what we are seeing happening in our politics today is not the fringe; it is our society. In particular, the episode I did with Akshay Mukul on his great book, The Gita Press, kind of brought this alive to me that Indian society has always had these currents. And what really happened in 47 is you had a group of unelected elites impose a relatively liberal constitution, not as liberal as you would like, but relatively liberal constitution on a largely illiberal society. And then we moved away from the task of actually making society more liberal, the bottom-up way as Gandhiji would have wanted. And the result is that today politics has caught up with society. What you see today is not an aberration; it is a real India, and that people like you and me have have to begin the fight all over again if we really care about the fight, and we have to think about it in a bottom-up way. The second realization is that our discourse has become both deeply polarized and deeply shallow, right? I often think of, like, speaking for myself, there are three problems India have which I think about. One is proximate, two are much deeper. The proximate problem is a political problem. I don't like the political party in charge. People may disagree with that. It's subjective, whatever. That's a proximate problem for me. But the two deeper problems are A, the oppressive nature of the Indian state, which is embedded in our constitution and in our DNA, and two, our deeply fractured society. And our politics is really supply responding to demand. It is a society which is like that, and changing the party in power is not going to make us less bigoted or less misogynist or any of those things. And to solve those problems, the state and the society, are much deeper problems no one talks about. Everybody's talking at this very shallow level of Modi bad, Rahul good, or vice versa, and all the discourses around that, and is deeply polarized and very, very simplistic, because everything is then around political lines where everything that Modi and Adityanath do is by default bad and the other side does is by default good, or vice versa, as the case might be. And that makes the discourse so simplistic that I don't participate anymore. Once upon a time, I was fairly political when it came to my tweets, and I got cancelled by all sides. But I simply don't participate because there is no space for nuance anymore. I mean, one example of that is just the way people look at the Constitution, that because there is this sense that, oh, the ruling party will want to change the Constitution to make it more Hindutva, as it were, we must therefore hold up the Constitution as a holy book. And I cannot think of anything more dangerous and pernicious than this. That if one side has a Manusmriti as a holy book, that does not mean that the other side has to have the Constitution as a holy book. The Constitution is deeply flawed, power is deeply centralized, federalism does not exist, only lip service is paid to it. The Constitution does not protect freedom of speech. Now, yes, it is liberal in some ways, it is deeply liberal in other ways. And I don't even think this is a burning subject that we need to talk about, but the point is that you simply cannot talk about all of this stuff because the discourse has become so poisonous that if you don't take one rigid purist party line, you're just going to get attacked and torn down. And that is also why I cherish the space that I have tried to build with the seen and the unseen, because I can have those conversations here. I can have a long discussion about all the problems with our epics with someone like Arshia Sattar, for example. Or I can do an episode with Tisra Setalwar after she'll just come out of jail. Or I can talk with a right-wing blogger like Kushal Mehra and not get attacked on, by all sides, because in a sense, there is a self-selected audience of people who crave the discourse. And that's my other realization, that the discourse out there in social media and elsewhere is really that of a vocal minority which is playing along tribalistic lines. The silent majority gets that the world is nuanced, that things are complicated, and therefore there are many, many people who want to listen to shows like mine or Milan's to get a sense of these currents, of these issues, and talk to people without either demonizing them or glorifying them, but just seeing them as human beings. So these learnings are something that have driven me away from engaging in real time on Twitter and elsewhere, but instead building these sort of conversations as a repository for the future, and even today for people who really care and who realize the complexity of the world.
I'll just add two things to it very quickly, Mukul, if that's okay.
Yeah.
One is just, it's interesting what you said about we are the minority. There is a quite a well-known quote by Jawaharlal Nehru, which I paraphrase, and of course, Goa has also written about this, that when he was asked that what is your greatest challenge in this moment, And he said that one of them, or perhaps the greatest challenge he's facing, is to fashion a secular republic in deeply religious country. But there's another one that is slightly less, its veracity is slightly perhaps questionable. But there is a conservative journalist from Oxford who had written this account of talking to Nehru off the record and asking him that, you think of yourself as this great democratic leader. Where is the opposition? Where is your opposition? He said, my opposition is the people. And one, of course, doesn't, he wasn't a Gandhi, he wasn't a Nehru fan, so one doesn't quite know if this is an embellished quote or not, but I get the sense of it. And the second thing I will say in agreement about the lack of nuance is I gave up writing actively in roughly 2020. And the reason was that I did a couple of pieces around them. Then one was about, there was a lot going on in Uttar Pradesh just before COVID hit. And I wrote a piece about why we're talking about Adityanath and why we're not talking about the fact that we have a deeply flawed criminal justice system and we've never paid attention to rule of law. And if these fundamental issues did not exist, we wouldn't have a phenomenon like Adityanath. He would have been in jail, in fact, and not be sitting as the Home Minister on the very files that need action against him. And the second piece I wrote was about, again, when COVID had hit, I've written a piece for Al Jazeera about how little we spend on healthcare and how little we've historically spent on healthcare and how that is the real issue and not, sort of the very myopic way in which we're talking about handling of COVID by a particular government. And I remember that there were comments even by people who I would think broadly come from the same point of view that I do, saying that because I got a lot, just before that, I'd done a piece on the lockdown for the New York Times, and just because saying that because she got so badly trolled for her NYT piece, she is apologizing by writing this piece, saying that, shifting the blame away from Modi and saying, well, and that just gave me a moment of pause. And I was like, I think I need to step away from actively writing my regular 2 pieces or 3 pieces in a month and need to think about what it is that I really want to say and if I have anything to say at all. And I think I do not exaggerate when I say, and I hope both of you will believe what I'm saying in this moment, that I have turned to both of your podcasts so many, many times where I've lost hope and felt like, my God, a space exists where you can have conversations that have so much nuance and that are removed from that sort of reactionary conversation we're all having on social media and does not adhere to the way in which the discourse, the very skewed way in which the discourse is being set up by vested parties. Sorry to cut you off.
No, not at all. That was also interesting by all of you. And what seems to be emerging here is this tension between state and society, right? The classic tension, both in what Milan said and what Amit and that Pragya said. And, I'm a social anthropologist. I spend most of my research time in very regular community, village, and mostly in rural India kind of settings. And the skepticism about society, Amit, that you were expressing, and that has been, going back to the Constitution and so on. Ambedkar was like, this is a democratic constitution on an extremely undemocratic soil. All of these points of view are one that I'm carrying when I go out to do research. And honestly, over 25 years of living and working in rural India, I'm not sure I agree, because yes, there is absolutely, this is not to deny that there is an ecosystem. If you read Kunal Purohit's H-Pop and see the political economy behind the spread of a certain kind of right-wing discourse, and that people go listen, sing those songs and talk about bloodshed with impunity. There's no denying any of that, right? What I'm saying is that there are resources in society which have nothing to do with politics, right? How people organize work, how people organize midday meals in a village, or how people organize religious ceremonies so as not to clash calendars across religions. This is something that in an ongoing way societies do, which is become irrelevant to politics in the way that we talk about politics with a capital P, which is mostly party politics and institutional politics, right? But society, religion, kinship, economy, these are aspects of society that are creating values that are actually really good for politics. So there are ideas, say, about redistribution that every religion has, that you must not keep everything you have. You must give away because there is always an awareness that other people don't have as much, and so on. There are ideas that are progressive, that are good for politics, that we don't have the language to take that seriously. That's one point. The second thing is that in the way that, again, society works, our idea of rural India, and remember, India is 60-70% rural, we keep forgetting this, that there are also, there is a stereotype of the rural that we work with, which is somehow that these are people who are bigoted, who are driven by caste, who are ignorant. And whether you come from right or left of politics, these are people whose consciousness has to be raised. And therefore, the task of the elite is somehow to raise this. Now, pushing back against this was a group of scholars and thinkers, even before the Indian Constitution was being written, who were not taken seriously enough, Gandhi being the most prominent of them. But, recently I've been reading a lot of Tagore. Right? And one thing that Tagore says is that there are resources to create what he calls Samaj or Samaj, which is about creating a kind of society where you're not in contact only with people you live with, but people you encounter through travel, through trade, through going to melas, where you are able to realize the potential for working with people you don't know in some sort of solidarity and collective action. Now, when we look at the history of India over the last 75 years, the significant numbers of social movements that have happened, right, where people have been able to mobilize in very large numbers behind issues, regardless of all of those factors that we trot out of caste and religion and so on, being present. So, it's not as if caste and religion have gone anywhere. It's just the resources for mobilizing and working together are also present. And we don't seem to think of them as resources for doing politics. When we talk about doing politics, it becomes party politics and patronage and caste mobilization and identity, criminality, as if there is no other. And, the biggest example of this, and I've written about this, and, like the rest of you have got my share of death threats and so on, is if you look at in the last 10 years, the most successful political moment really has been the farmers' movement to me. Because you saw people come together for a whole year in protest against what they thought were 3 laws that were wrong. It's as simple as that. But in order to do that, you're required to have a sort of movement culture, right? A politics of protest, of how you conduct yourselves during that protest, with civility, with discipline, with camaraderie, keeping your eye on the goal. And this also is the inheritance of Indian politics. This also is the inheritance of the freedom movement and so on. And somehow these two kinds of politics have become increasingly divorced, both in how we think about India, but also to my mind, to a certain extent, even how academic writing on politics is done on India. Because if anything has got to change, it will change through the politics that happens in between elections, right? It is when people are being active citizens, of being aware of changes in law, of distortions in the election commission, or protesting like people did recently in Maharashtra. Why were the number of votes polled and the votes counted not matching? People came out in protest. They were shut down, but they did come out in protest. And so we need a lot more, we need more active citizenship of this kind, which to my mind is that bridge between society and state. And I wonder sometimes whether even those of us writing about Indian politics make the effort to make that linkage enough, between what happens in the formal arena of politics and what is happening in society, which is also political. Society is not just caste and religion. That's also politics.
These are very wide words. These are very wise words. If you'll indulge me to ask just one question, I promise just one small question, which is that, I agree with everything you said. India, of course, contains multitudes and so on and so forth. But I don't see a recognition of this in our politics, in the sense that the fact that there is a Hindu vote, or the notion that there is a Hindu vote appears to be given for all political parties. So when Kejriwal wins, he'll do Hanuman Chalisa. When the Babri Masjid judgment comes, and Priyanka Gandhi will say, boast, oh, my father was the one who opened the gates, and so on and so forth. There seems to be a sense among all political parties that this is a non-negotiable. You can't wish away the Hindutva side of it, so we've all got to do some version of it, or pander to it, or pretend to be believers, and etc., etc. And then we can do other things. And I don't know why this is. Like, at one level, in an idealistic way, I think that, people contain multitudes. There might be a person who believes in Hindutva, but he also wants a better future for his children and more jobs and more prosperity. Why don't you appeal to the better angels of their natures? Why always, pander to this side? But on the other hand, then I remind myself that I'm being idealistic. The parties have skin in the game, unlike any of us. And they know the ground reality much better than we do. And if they are always pandering to this stuff, then, maybe they're right. So either they're right or they're wrong. But if they're wrong, it's a setup for disruption of some sort. So, I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
No, the question was probably for Mukulika, but I'll just quickly add something, which is perhaps a little contrarian. Now, of course, on the face of fact, this is happening, that, Kejriwal will read the Hanuman Chalisa, Priyanka Gandhi will say, my father got the locks open, and so on. But one thing that we should always remember is that this is what we are seeing, and we're assuming that these people know better. But I have enough reason to doubt that they do. And what I mean by this is that the Indian voter is complex. We know that. But I think when it comes to trying to figure out why elections went one way or another, the sheer nature and scale of complexity baffles even the best of us. So to go back to Joan Robinson, everything you say, there's also a sort of counterpoint to it. Now, to my mind, the way I understand Hindutva politics and this phenomenon of a Hindu vote, the RSS has been trying to create a Hindu vote for a very, very long time. In the 90s, they had a light bulb moment and said, damn it, we can't do it without the Shudras, so to speak, and then, tried to change their own outreach and so on and so forth. But every time I am on ground, I am not quite sure that this Hindu vote has really come to fruition. And like everybody else, I don't have any evidence to back this up. But my sense is that the BJP is getting votes for a couple of things it's getting right. And when it comes to the things it's getting wrong, it is helping them to create distraction in the name of Hindu politics. My concern is much more the integrity of the electoral process than the Hindu vote. This might be complete naivete, but time will tell. Sorry, Mukulik.
No, that second point is the one of my 2 points in response to Amit's question. One is, the structural reasons of Indian politics. And Milan's written about crime and money in Indian elections. And since his book has come out, Milan, what year was that?
2017.
2017. The year electoral bonds came in, right? And once electoral bonds have come in and the election commission and the commissioners are appointed in this partisan way, which they now are through amending the law, As somebody who's been watching elections for 25 years in India, I honestly cannot say hand on heart that these are free and fair elections. Okay, if there's a continuum, Russia might be at one end, but India is not that bad because a lot of people go out and vote. But the playing field in which anyone can contest an election and the money required and so on is just simply would not be acceptable in a lot of other contexts that we call democracies. And 2024 was a very interesting year because there were 90 odd elections across the world. We were thinking comparatively. For once, we were looking at the Indian election compared to a lot of other elections across all the continents. And you could say that if you knew anything about the way Indian elections are conducted, this is not to compare it to anyone else. There's no one else deciding whether these are fair. Just by India's own record, if you compare India's own record of how it used to conduct its own elections some years ago and now, you can say that there's been a deterioration of standards and that integrity is compromised. So when we are talking about, messaging and so on, we are also talking about players in a field that is very uneven and very tilted already. Having said that, I do not personally understand why there isn't, in fact, greater mobilization along issues that I certainly hear on the ground when I travel, and I'm sure all of you do, which is, say, for instance, the research I'm doing at the moment with my colleague Pavitra Suryanarayanan on the impact of GST, right? What GST has done, it is a brilliant innovation that nobody disagrees with that. It's a one nation, one tax, it's simplified process and paperwork. Everybody agrees this was. But the manner in which it was implemented has meant that a huge host of small players have had to exit. State capacity, bureaucratic knowledge has been hollowed out in very particular ways. And the connection between GST and unemployment, which is something that we really need to think about more. Why? We know there is rising unemployment, but what the impact of GST has done on creating unemployment is something we need to think about very seriously and look at the evidence on that. But people on the ground, again, talking about away from that arena of formal politics, just your ordinary Joe on the street sees this, and they'll say that, yeah, these guys used to run a little mom and pop store or used to run a mechanic repair shop, and they've just gone bust because they could not cope for various reasons, complicated reasons. So, taxation, and partly because I'm thinking about the politics of taxation at the moment, I'm surprised that politics of, taxation is not talked about more because as we are talking about state and society, it's the one thing that links society to the state, right? You're paying a certain amount of tax that India places this huge burden of taxation on the poor, contrary to the Chatterati who talk on social media. Yes, the middle class is very voluble, but actually the proportion of tax revenue coming from poor people is much higher through indirect taxes than your average middle class person. These are electoral issues, surely, but they don't become election issues. Instead, what we are talking about is the kind of thing that we're saying. And are they not being raised because it's an uneven playing field? I don't know. It seems to be, it could be a combination of factors.
I mean, at the end of the day, I'm struck by the paucity of imagination, or perhaps the poverty of imagination when it comes to the opposition parties, right? I just finished reading last night Yamini Iyer's new book, which I'll do an episode on soon, which is her lessons from 3 years of ethnographic study of the Delhi public school reforms, the government school reforms, which the AAP government launched. And, her study ends right before COVID, so it doesn't really cover the most recent years. But, she makes several claims in that book, which I think are by now sort of well known, which is that, this was such a rare, whatever you think of Arvind Kejriwal or the Aam Aadmi Party, such a rare opportunity where a political party actually staked its electoral claim on remedying public education, right? And you just simply can't think of many other examples which that's happened. And when you talk to people, again, going back to what Pragya mentioned, Mukuliki mentioned, ordinary people, right? Basic health, education, these sort of social amenities are very important to them, right? But I feel like they're nowhere in the discourse, and I think in some ways this is true about a broader range of issues. I mean, take something that's controversial like the Uniform Civil Code, right? I think there are many liberals in India who believe that, yes, after 75 years of independence, we should have a UCC if it's truly done in a kind of impartial, technocratic way, right? People like Ram Guha have been on record saying this. So, but rather than waiting for the BJP to present their version of the UCC, which we can imagine what it might look like and what sort of characteristics it might have, why hasn't the opposition spent the past, 10 years thinking about what its vision would be rather than playing defense, right? And I fear this is something that we're going to see in the United States as well. The Democrats today are living in fear of what the Trump tax cuts to billionaires will look like, instead of saying, this is what our middle-class tax plan should be. And I feel like we've gotten into this cycle in many places where you have dominant political parties, right? Where there's this game of constantly being on defense, of saying, no, we're not for that. And it's a bit trite or hackneyed to say, but there's a real positive saying, but actually this is what we would like to do, right? That's different and unique if we were brought to power.
Well, absolutely. I think a question that flows from what we just discussed from talking about Hindu politics is trying to understand the Hindu vote through the prism of the alternative idea to India, if you will, which, like you pointed out earlier, Amit, people like Akshay have documented in their marvelous work. None of this is new. This is not obviously a 2014 onwards phenomena. And quite recently, both of you have spoken with different writers on Savarkar, who in many ways is the sort of first really articulates the idea of Hindutva, that kernel, which then goes on to form the basis of the RSS and eventually leads us to this moment in time. Now, of course, that's not to say that Savarkar, when it comes to the Mahasabha, there was a fair amount of disagreement, even between the Bengal chapter and the Maharashtra chapter, on what Hindutva or a Hindu India might look like. But since both of you have spoken at length about Savarkar, I wonder what those conversations did for you, how they made you see what's going on right now in a different or new light. Amit, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I spoke with Vinayak Chaturvedi recently, who interestingly was named after Savarkar, though he realized it a little later in life, and he's written a wonderful book. I haven't yet read Janki's book, which I believe is really good. I'm looking forward to that, but I've read all the previous books on Savarkar pretty much. I'm struck by a couple of things. One is that it's almost as if to discuss Savarkar in some ways, as Vinayak also pointed out, is something that is frowned upon by some people, that you have to look at him as a purely black and white figure. When I read his early biographies, like by Vaibhav Purandare and so on, the first thing you realize is his life is really a story of two halves. And in the first half, till about 1910, if he dies in 1910 instead of being imprisoned, he's basically a Bhagat Singh figure. He was doing exactly the same kind of things, the same kind of revolutionary, saying the same kind of things. I think Nehru praised one of his books. Gandhiji shared a platform with him. He was saying, and everything Savarkar said on record on Muslims before this is that Hindus and Muslims have to be, part of this struggle together against the British. So nothing that any of us would object to. And then there are those years of imprisonment and brutal torture. And obviously the jailers were British, but their enforcers were Muslims and even Pathans, and the kind of torture that was done is practically unspeakable, right? If you read biographies of other people in that era who were also in their Andamans, you figure that out. And then he comes out as a complete madman, a complete bigot, and he absolutely hates Muslims. And the explanation, of course, is not exculpation, but it's interesting to see it in this light. My other sort of thought about Savarkar is that his book on Hindutva is a truly awful book. It is practically unreadable. I tried to engage with it in good faith, and it is unreadable. It's not cogent, it's incoherent. And his central assertion is really interesting. His central assertion is that only those can be considered to belong to this land whose holy land and homeland is both India. So that leaves out the Muslim, because even if their homeland is India, they're praying to Mecca, and that leaves out Christians obviously, because ditto. And he makes this formulation specifically arising out of his prejudices, because he doesn't because earlier he was just against the British, now he also wants to other the Muslims. And this is a convenient formulation that everybody basically picks up on, and no one asks the question, why? Why is it the case that this is how you are defining it? In an excellent episode that Shruti Kapila did with me, she gave me this great quote, I remember, where she said, Hindutva is a theory of violence in search of a history, right? And that history is being concocted every day on the WhatsApp groups around us as we speak. So in that sense, Savarkar's formulation works brilliantly. Like you mentioned, my recent episode with Manu Pillai, who's written this wonderful book, Guns, Gods and Missionaries. And he talks about the different political strains, and you can actually, see that line, how the thinking is developing from Dayanand Saraswati of the Arya Samaj to, Tilak, who has the same kind of instincts, but not a theoretical formulation. And then Savarkar, in this completely incoherent book, otherwise, gives it this formulation, which is internally consistent, but doesn't go into the why. And then if you take that as your starting point, as axiomatic, that only these people belong here and no one else, then everything else can flow from there. These are my feelings about Hindutva, but also about Savarkar, but also just in all the episodes that I've discussed it with various people and the reading I've done, I think Hindutva also contains multitudes. Hindu Mahasabha is very, very different from RSS. They fight with each other. There are many different strains happening there. If you look at, you mentioned Nehru earlier. Now, if Nehru did not exist, our first prime minister would definitely, our first group of leaders, they were entirely Hindu nationalists of a much more benign sense. Whether you're talking about, Patel or Pant or Rajendra Prasad or even Lal Bahadur Shastri later. Lal Bahadur Shastri was a Hindu nationalist leader, but had the great wisdom to say when he was in office that what I believe in personally has nothing to do with what I do as prime minister, right? And it is then an open question that if one of them could be very starkly different and better, but all social terms where you don't know what direction it could have got in. So I just think that this is deeply, deeply complex, and I don't know if Savarkar today in the popular imagination is as central as we think he is. People will invoke his name and they'll be like Savarkar, Savarkar everywhere. But nobody's really read the book in the original. Nobody will even, repeat this formulation that I came up with. What you have is much baser tribal instincts, the othering of Muslims most particularly. And then these are just iconic names that you take, like we take the names of God sometimes. But I don't know if there's a resonance of what Savarkar actually was with the current time. Like Savarkar, used to do these gatherings, and he did them for many years, where he would insist that all castes eat together, that Dalits also eat together with the upper caste, and this really pissed off the Brahmins and etc., etc. And, no one discusses this particular strain of his, and I wonder how many, what a lot of people would feel about it today. So I think, yeah, their ideas are relevant in an interesting kind of way when you think about the journey of ideas. But even people on the right don't really care about him today. He's just a name.
It's before I go on to you, Milan, and I know that a lot of things that Amit has brought up, you have addressed with Janki, particularly about the turn, which Janki does this a little bit skeptical about the turn in the prison that leads him to become a lot more fundamentalist. And, some of the other things that he's brought up, particularly about how we look at his anti-caste stance. But one of the things that of late when Mohan Bhagwat was attacked quite viciously on Twitter because for the second time he came out and said that we have to stop looking for temples under every mosque. We have to stop looking for trishuls under every dome. And he was viciously attacked on Twitter. It made me think of, when in the initial years when I had started to study the RSS in 2012, 2013, one of the things that used to strike me, and I used to say quite glibly, is that perhaps RSS's greatest sin is that it wiped out the entire sphere of thinking about Hindutva and Hindu-ness and Hindu politics. And what I mean by that is that, it became the sort of sole arbiter of Hindutva politics and Hindutva ideology at the expense of the Rais and the Tilaks and even Shama Prasad Mukherjee and a lot of thinkers in Bengal, including Aurobindo, and perhaps even Savarkar. So it was very interesting for me to see that that sort of cannibalization that had happened at that point in time in 25 and the first initial decades of the RSS. Perhaps RSS is at the risk of that happening to it today, where it's going to be devoured by its own. But sorry, Milan, if you could just pick up on
No, I mean,
what
I
you said
just
about Savarkar.
three quick reflections. I mean, I think the first on Amit's first point, which is that, can you even have a conversation about Savarkar with an author who's written a book, or is that kind of verboten? Can you be canceled? I mean, I remember I have a friend who wrote a book about the BJP's kind of electoral machinery, right? Which went into great detail about, the technology, the money, how the ground game, the Panna Pramukhs, and so on and so forth. And, immediately people started to call him a Sanghi, right? As if like studying this object of immense fascination and relevance is somehow, crossing a line. The second is that, I think one of the things we've learned over the past 10 years, and we should have known it already, but I think we sort of gave it short shrift, is that the question arose after May 2014 is, what is the relationship going to be like between Narendra Modi and the RSS? And many people reflexive response was, well, they're one and the same, right? So Modi is the RSS. And I think it's so much more complicated than that. And we saw that in the general election campaign, where many elements of the Sangh were quite pissed off with the BJP and Narendra Modi. And then we've seen what can happen when they come back to the fold, as they've done in Haryana and Maharashtra, right, which led to impressive BJP victories. So for me, and it's more of a critique of academia, Mukulika, in particular my field, political science, is, this arguably is one of the most important questions we have in India today. I cannot name a single person doing a PhD on this subject, right, which is what is the relationship between the BJP and RSS? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What are the vulnerabilities? How have things worked out? And the last book that I think most of us cite on this from my world is Tarak Tatral's book, which is a brilliant book about the expansion of the BJP through the RSS and various Sangh entities. But really very little since then. Just one thing on Savarkar, just to echo a point that Amit made, is, to me, as somebody who hasn't read all of the books on Savarkar like Amit has, I was coming in with it with, the little excerpts of his I've read and what I've read people have said about him, right? And what emerged to me from Janaki's book, which I recommend everyone read because it's, first of all, just a brilliant piece of scholarship, exhuming everything he has done in the original Marathi, that, he was this atheist who confronted on many occasions Hindu conservatives and yet emerged as their flag bearer. I mean, in 1935, he wrote an article that Janaki cites where he says, the cow, a useful animal, not our mother, definitely not a god, right? I mean, so he had this kind of really irreverent streak, right? He took on this issue of temple entry, right? He promoted intermarriage both across regional and caste lines, right? And so I think there has been this kind of almost like cartoonish form of what Savarkar is, that, as Amit mentions, is perhaps quite disassociated from his true multitudes, which is not to say that the belief in Hindutva was not genuine, but that there were these other aspects of him that we've forgotten.
This allows us to perhaps move a little bit away from the substance of this to address a very hot topic that is in discussion at the moment about India, which is academic history, how it's written, and how it can counter what's called WhatsApp history. Both of you have referred to it, these cartoonish depictions both of India's past, but also the heroes. For those who are not aware of this, I mean, there is a whole ecosystem in which millions of people every day receive forwards on WhatsApp outlining some aspect of Indian history or the other, the veracity of which is questionable, to put it mildly. They're just made up facts a lot of the time. Sometimes maybe there are things that are true. But as has already been mentioned in this conversation by several of us, that there is a rewriting of India's past to fit in to reflect this particular political ideology, right? Amit, this is what you were saying. Now, the pushback has been what's happening in Indian publishing at the moment, of course, is a whole different story. We should talk about that separately. But it is true that the histories that are bestsellers and that are read widely by a range of readers are not academic historians, i.e., people who teach in universities, who do research in particular according to protocols, teach students, publish in academic journals, but people who do the research, they're absolutely, well versed in research techniques, and it's very robust material, but who write in a way that is more accessible, that is not difficult prose, and very importantly, are published by trade publishers who push their books across, they're books that you will find in airport bookshops, for instance, unlike academic histories. And so one blame, which William Dalrymple, who's written yet another fantastic and fascinating book on India's past, The Golden Road, but a much wider history of what the Indosphere. William Dalrymple said recently, and both of you must have heard this, that, part of the problem of WhatsApp history is precisely because academic historians don't get that history out well enough, don't communicate that research. And then, I think yesterday, I just saw it this morning, but Romila Thapar has pushed back and said that's complete nonsense. And there's been a huge hue and cry. But both of you, straddling the space between academic writing, popular writing, you're seeing which books do well or not. What are your thoughts on this debate?
Sorry, I'm just going to add to that question, Mukulika, because I think this can be a broader question. But before I do, I unfortunately don't have the quote on me. I'm clearly liberally quoting Nehru today. But one of the most interesting things, when this whole argument had erupted, which to my mind is just, a completely nonsensical argument. I think there's a role for popular historians and then there's a role for academics. If the likes of Romila hadn't done the work that they've done, I think a lot of the wonderful popular historical writing that's coming out, they would not have anything to base their research on and so on. But one of the interesting quotes that I came across in Professor Aditya Mukherjee's recent book on Nehru is Nehru speaking to a hall full of historians and exhorting them and telling them that, do not simply write for your brother historians, write for the general public, because if you don't, you risk history being co-opted for political reasons. So I don't have it in full on me, so I'm paraphrasing. I put it out on Twitter. I will share this offline with the rest of you. But just to come back to the question, I thought we could expand the ambit a bit. Both of you have done episodes on misinformation. Milan, you, if I'm not wrong, if I'm not mistaken, you did a conversation on the book Love, Jihad and Other Fictions. And Amit, of course, you've spoken to Pratik and his wonderful colleagues. So I was just wondering if you want to take this question in the broader sense based on those episodes.
So I would say that actually, there are two separate questions here and two separate things, and I'd like to separate them. And one is the whole issue of academic history versus popular history, and the other is a question of the narrative warfares that go on. And we shouldn't mix these two, because it is not the case that all popular history leads to WhatsApp forwards. They're completely different. Some of the historians who've been on my show, like Ramchandra Guha and Manu Pillai, are people who were once derided by academic historians for not having the credentials and for being popular historians in a sense. Now, when we speak of academic history, I think that there are two sort of issues, and one is the one that Nehru correctly pointed out, which is that academic historians tend to write in prose that is too turgid and does not reach a wider audience. And I would say that if you are an expert in any subject and you feel it matters, it is practically a moral responsibility to write in prose that can reach more people. If you feel your field is important, you must do that. And that's a great problem. And Agnes Gallard had a great essay on why academic prose is so turgid. I mean, that was more in the context of economists, but I think it can apply to any academic prose, which is worth looking at. But at the same time, there are many academic historians and many people within academia who write clear prose. So it clearly can be done, and you're not just writing for your peers. The other thing I would like to say is that, barring exceptions, I have deep skepticism of academia itself. I think the academic world has degraded massively over the last few decades. At one point, academia was a center of the knowledge society where knowledge was discovered and produced and disseminated and learned and etc. etc. Today, it has just become a circle jerk of people who are disconnected with, especially in the humanities, of scholars who are doing studies that have no relation to the real world, and they are just talking to each other, and these are echo chambers, and they're completely irrelevant to the real world, and it's almost a tragic loss of talent and intelligence and capability. And they get into this particular game by just responding to the incentives that are there within academia. Publish a set number of papers in this set number of journals. This is the kind of language you're expected to use. And more perniciously, these are the academic fashions of the day. Are you doing history? Fine. This is the lens through which you must look at history. Otherwise, you're cancelled. This is what you're allowed to talk about and not allowed to talk about. I chatted with the great historian the great sociologist Timur Kuran recently on my show, who's written some remarkable books that explain the modern times. My favorite book of his is, Public Lies, Private Truths, written in 99. And he was saying that if he was young today, he could not have done the kind of work that he's done. He simply could not have, because he's taken deep, nuanced views of Islam, which would simply not be permitted in today's academia. So I think that academic historians also need to look within. There is certainly a rot, and I strongly object when there is any of this gatekeeper instinct that we are academic historians and others are not allowed to write for it. No, I'm a free speech absolutist. I believe in the marketplace of ideas. I believe anyone who wants to write a book of history absolutely should. That is where we get Ramchandra Guha and Manu Pillai from, and Srinath Raghavan, who was in the army. You could argue, hey, what business does he have to, write a book of history? But he's one of our finest. So as far as that is concerned, I would say let the marketplace of ideas kind of sort it out. And if you are an academic historian and you believe your ideas are important, then you're welcome to do my writing course. I will help you write cogently for a wider audience. I actually believe that it is your moral responsibility to do so if you feel your ideas matter. And it is my moral responsibility to help you for a fee, of course. And therefore, yeah, so, and as far as the narrative battles are concerned, it's just a really wide subject. So it's deeply distressing, but the bottom line is that we just have to keep at it. And I don't think there are easy answers, because it is so easy for an organized machinery to get a piece of misinformation out to 10 million people, and your little fact check will reach 1,000 people, and what do you do about it? And it's a grave problem. But to fight that fight is our dharma, and we are playing the long game, so we have to continue, and I don't have any answers. Maybe Milan has answers.
No, I don't have answers on that, but I do have a little bit more sympathy, I think, than Amit has for our academic colleagues. Mukulika, I'm sure you have even more than I have.
Yes.
You have even more than I have, but just reflect, having done a PhD, having been an outlier and not continuing on in mainstream academia and going to work at a think tank, I look at my peers and the pressures they're under in, political science departments in terms of, conforming to a certain set of norms. And I realize the frustrations and the tensions and the very real world practical trade-offs they have to make, which is why, though, Amit, I endorse your second point, which is that when people write for the masses, particularly when academics try to do that, I think we should embrace it and celebrate it. And here I just want to, mention what I thought was one of the best books of 2024, at least in terms of who appeared on Grand Tamasha, which was Karthik Muralidharan's book, which for those of you who haven't read it, it's called Accelerating India's Development. And it's, here's a guy who's not even, I think, 50 years old, who's had like a 25-year record of publishing academic texts on questions around, really important questions around sort of development and prosperity in India, who has written a book, while it's very long, 600 pages plus 200 pages of notes, is very accessible. And you can read any one chapter and get something out of it without having read the whole book. And the reason I think we should celebrate it is because I think there are other people like him, and I understand it's harder to do early on in your career, but who have the ability to do this. And I think, it is risky. You do have to deal with colleagues saying, well, this isn't really serious work. How have you possibly spent 5 or 6 years on this? But it is a really signal contribution. And I think, it does show you that there is an alternative path. Granted, it may not be available to you as a first-year assistant professor, but I do think it's one that becomes more open to you as time goes on.
For our final question, to a quote from the Seen and Unseen in Amit Varma, I'd like to double-click on the Karthik Dharan intervention that you just made. I think we've been talking about what really matters on the ground, and I think we can't not talk about the economic sort of potential and pitfalls of this country. We've been hearing now for decades that India is poised to become the greatest, second greatest, third greatest, what have you, superpower in the world when it comes to being an economic superpower. And we always just seem to be on the cusp of it, but never quite getting there. And both of you have had the privilege to sit down with so many fine minds when it comes to understanding the structural issues, when it comes to understanding the data, when it comes to understanding what is going wrong, what is missing, and what needs to be done. And I wonder if there are any big ideas, observations, takeaways that you've had from those conversations that you can sum up for our audience. Perhaps you can start with.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to, second what Milan said about Karthik's excellent book. I think it is really important that there might be academics who might say, hey, where are the novel ideas, etc., whatever academics say to discourage other academics. But I feel that it's a public service to get these ideas out there, to, put the book out there so then it can become a reference point. And we need, like one of the great paucities and something that people like Milan and me and many others should really feel responsible to fill is those foundational books on which other thinkers and scholars can build later on, like Ajay Shah and Vijay Kelkar did in Service of the Republic, which is to me a foundational book on how to think about public policy in India. Karthik's done his book, Pranay Kotasane regularly churns out, I think almost every week, a book of that sort, and they're much needed. Pranay is amazing. You've all got to have him on your show. And but here's the thing that I think where I feel frustrated with where economics is today is that we had this golden period between 91 and 2011. And when we talk about economics today, we have politicized it completely. Either we talk about the glory of where India is right now and the exaggerated growth rates, or we go in completely the opposite direction. And the thing is, the data to me doesn't really say as much as it should, because the informal economy is just completely, not calculated well enough. The old proxies don't work. Pragya, earlier when you spoke about GST, I agree with you wholeheartedly. The botched implementation of GST and the complete humanitarian disaster of demonetization before that devastated our informal economy. I recently did a 10.5-hour episode of The Seen and the Unseen with the economist Rajeshwari Shengupta, and she was talking about, the K-shaped recovery since then, that one part of society does well, so you've got great real estate rates and a rising stock market. The other side tanks, and, we came up with the phrase K-shaped economy, that is where we are today. But what is visible in the data and what is visible in all the numbers that you'll see is the upper side of the K, not the lower side, not the people who are not doing well. That fills me with disquiet. And what I also have doubts about, and I've argued with Karthik on this, is that, there are easy questions and there are tough questions. I think all of us agree that the Indian state does too many things badly when it should do a few things well, and we wanted to focus on those few things. We all agree on that. But I think that there is a danger in talking, there is a danger in overemphasizing the centrality of state action in all of this. And that is something that is easy to talk about because you can propose a solution, you've got ready numbers, and whatever interventions you make are measurable and attributable. So it is very tempting to go in that direction and say, and do RCT upon RCT about utterly trivial questions that make no difference to the world. Like a great influence to my thinking on this is the economist Land Pritchett, not just because of his incredible failing state paper, but also recent papers, and I have a long episode with him discussing this, where we now know that ultimately all human welfare indicators, whether they are good health or happiness or whatever, have a 99% correlation with per capita GDP. Everything else, welfare, redistribution, all of that is less than 1%. He studied this across multiple countries, across multiple decades. It all comes down to per capita GDP, which is growth. And therefore, that's where we need to focus. But that, when you make interventions in that regard, when you free up markets, when the government gets out of the way, it's not measurable, it's not attributable, it takes a long time to play out. With the limited amounts of freedoms that we did allow in the 91 reforms, you had 200, 300 million people come out of poverty. My friend Nitin Pai of the Takshashila Institution has calculated that every 1% rise in GDP gets 3 million people out of poverty in India. His number earlier was 2 million. He's revised it to 3 million in the light of new evidence. And it is possible that DMON and GST, the way they were done, actually push people backwards. That's entirely possible. But therefore, the focus has to be on growth. But my worry is that given the ideological fashions of the time, where India is fundamentally leftist across all political parties when it comes to economics, that it is always state, 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 and it's not freedom, freedom, freedom. No one is talking about this. And my danger is that when you only focus on how you can make the state function better, which is necessary and important, that there is a crowding out in terms of what there is in the discourse about the centrality of freedom to this. And that deeply worries me because, I've done many episodes, on what the 91 reforms did. I have episodes of The Seen and the Unseen on it. I've got episodes with Montek Singh Ahluwalia and KP Krishnan and etc., etc. Episode 28 of my YouTube show, The Reformers, is just on that period. We lost all the lessons of that time. We chucked away the reforms community. In those times, politicians used to speak with each other across the table. A delightful story that just makes me so nostalgic and happy is about how in 2014, KP Krishnan, the great bureaucrat who did a 8-hour episode with me, along with his colleagues, designed inflation targeting, and they took it to Chidambaram, and he loved it, and Manmohan approved. But Chidambaram, with his great grace, said that there are elections, I will leave it for the next government to implement this. And lo and behold, a government changed, and Krishnan went to Arun Jaitley on his first day at the finance ministry at about 6 p.m. and gave him the whole doc and said that, hey, this is great and we feel we should do this. And the next morning, Arun Jaitley tells him that, yeah, let's do it. And Krishnan is like, whoa, 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 this is a deeply fundamental change. I want it deeply, but don't you think you need more time to read it? And Jaitley just turned and he said that if India's finest legal mind and finest economic mind have said that this should be done, then this should be done. And he was referring to Manmohan Singh and Chidambaram. And we have lost this grace in our politics today as well. Our politics today is a landscape of small, petty people across parties with no exceptions, and that also makes me deeply sad. But to go back to the economic question, I think, first of all, it is hard to even come up with an idea of what we are doing because it's bipolar, it's K-shaped, and no one's measuring the informal economy and the damage that has happened there, or thinking deeply about the jobs crisis and what the structural and fundamental reasons for that would be. And equally, I think we need to get past all these shallow, short-term solutions of handouts which do nothing in the long run and, talk about what really matters. We need to get people out of poverty, period, and the only route to that is growth.
Milan, one of the things that Amit spoke about was the K-shaped recovery, and in your episode with Maitrish, you speak about how to read recent data on poverty and inequality. And of course, there are so many other conversations. What would you like to add to this in terms of takeaway?
No, I mean, I think just, the past several weeks have been really instructive, reading the eulogies and columns about the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. And, just to kind of, generalize, right? I mean, the tone and tenor has been absolutely brilliant. Finance minister in 91, pretty average prime minister on the economy from 2004 to 2014, who, there was this unfulfilled promise of a kind of second wave of reforms, which we all know the reasons and the political economy behind it, didn't ever come to fruition. And in some sense, as Amit said, we're still waiting for that moment, right? And I think what is a bit dispiriting when I reflect on the conversations that I've had with people like Sajid Chinoy, Pranjal Bandari, Arvind Subramanian, I mean, these are some of the best economists India has, is that, I don't think any of them are doom and gloom, right? I mean, they believe that even steady state, the Indian economy will muddle through. But will we look back at this moment, 10 years, 20 years hence and say, when there was this opportunity of the China +1 moment, with such a strong government that had the legislative heft to actually get things done, when actually the geopolitics, given the fragmentation we're seeing in the global order, created an opportunity that India has just not sufficiently taken advantage of it. I was reading something over the weekend about, what Donald Trump 2.0 is going to mean for India. And the fact of the matter is, what economists like Sajid say on trade is, it's not going to make a whole lot of difference because India, frankly, doesn't have a lot of exposure when it comes to exports, right? And so, yes, Vietnam could get badly hurt, but India doesn't feature strongly enough into global supply chains, right? And if you look at the lessons from the first Trump administration and the trade war and the increased tariffs, the lion's share of the gains went to places like Vietnam and Taiwan and not India, right? So it leaves one with feeling a little bit of despair. If we have a budget coming up in a couple of weeks, and the question on everyone's mind is, what's going to be in it and what's going to happen. I don't think there's any sense we have outside of saying we have these aspirations of Viksit Bharat and a $5 trillion economy of how we actually get from point A to point B, nor can we point to specific legislative reform steps that we think are likely to happen in the near future. And I think that's troubling.
I think it's quite befitting that this is going to be our longest episode so far. But I wish we had more time. We will close on this, but we are going to try and take a promise from you that both of you will come back and speak with us at length again. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Mukulika, before we close out?
No, it does. This very last bit of the conversation did make me think. I think about this often, and now working on GST and taxation, that where I work, it's the London School of Economics and Political Science. This is not how it started. There was a time when it used to be called political economy. And political science and economics were not separated in the way that they are now. And I think so much of what we are talking about in the context of India, really the problem is precisely there. And looking at the economic discourse on growth without considering the political agenda of redistribution is going to lead to the kind of K-shaped growth we are getting. And this is a deep, deep worry. I'm not impressed by growth figures if the number of people, if social inequality rises at the way it is rising. So on that slightly grim note, but realistic note, I think we will draw this to a close. Maybe come back. Let's see what the year has in store for us and take stock maybe towards the end of the year. But thank you so much, Milan Vaishnav and Amit Varma. You're both busy people and you've made time for this fantastic conversation, sharing your insights, your anecdotes, your favorites. No doubt people are going to love this. To our listeners, if you did enjoy this episode, please don't ask us to do many more of the kind because we can't have these two gentlemen back very quickly. But if you do have ideas of things that you would like us to look at in more detail, talk to other experts, or Pragya and I can and do some research and talk about it as we promised with the India briefing on any particular issue, please do write to us at tib.oijo.in. And when you find our podcast on any of the platforms that you access your podcast, do remember to subscribe and like if you do, so the algorithms work and you get to hear of our new episode when it drops. So thank you all again very much and see you next time.
Thank you.